Hi everybody and welcome to my second video on tips for teachers, and today's video is titled Marking Made Easy. So when I became an English teacher, I looked at the expectation of marking and I just was pretty much overwhelmed and found it to be the most depressing part of the job. And I looked for ways to make it more efficient and effective, and I came up with a system that many of you may already be using. It's not mind-blowing, but it really does work for me, and it cuts my marking time right down from well, it probably now takes me about 30% of the time it would have taken me to mark under the conventional method. So that's what I'll share with you in this video. The question, though, I want you to consider, because marking and assessment is quite a contentious issue, and some of you might not like my ideas depending on your answer to this question. My question is, what is the purpose of marking? Why do we mark work that students complete? Now, it's my belief there are probably 4 different purposes of marking. To let students know how they are performing academically. So it's one way of feeding back to students on a piece of work that they've completed to let them know how they've done. Of course, studies show that dialogue is much more powerful than written feedback, and I think I'll do a video in the future on that day-to-day oral feedback and questioning and that kind of thing. But obviously when a student completes a piece of written work, maybe a homework task or a controlled assessment, or just a piece of writing in class, one of the ways of giving feedback is through marking that work. And one of the reasons we do that is to let students know how they've done. Another thing is it's to let students know how to improve their academic performance. So good marking will always include what I call a next step target. So this is how you did, and this is something you need to do to improve next time around. And that is something that students particularly do look for in a piece of written work. For us as teachers, we use marking to inform our future lessons. You should be hopefully operating on the next step teaching model, where you do a piece of work with a class and you mark that piece of work and you look for the areas that they don't understand or their weaknesses, and you use those weaknesses to inform your planning. So those weaknesses become the area that you're going to teach on over the next couple of lessons. And that's why in my previous video on endpoint planning, you'll see that there is a section for based on my knowledge of the class, learning needs to focus on, because this is all about your specific class. And if you're one of the people thinking, well, what's the difference between the endpoint plan and a medium-term plan? Well, a medium-term plan is not specific to your class and the needs and knowledge and strengths and weaknesses of your class. And a medium-term plan is just, what are all of the classes in year 10 doing? The endpoint plan is, okay, that's how I am going to tackle this for my group, given their projected grades, target grades, their strengths, their weaknesses, etc. So good marking will allow us as teachers to pick out what we need to focus on in future lessons. And of course, one of the other things that we do with our marking is we use it for data. So you probably have a system where you have to log grades into some kind of online computer system. You have to write reports and feedback on performance levels and that kind of thing. So marking is an intrinsic part of that. Well, I think I have a really good system for doing all of that. The old school approach, of course, is to grab your red pen and to sit and to read through the work, scribbling all over it when you find something good, when you find something bad, when you find something that is interesting. And I think this approach is basically not a very good one for a couple of reasons. Number one, why do we always choose a red pen? It's such an aggressive colour, and when you get your work back covered in red ink, it doesn't exactly look good. But number two, I think it's not an efficient way of marking work. I really realised this when, as a teacher, I was writing a lot of comments on students' work that were essentially the same. Because, if I was teaching them about writing in P paragraphs and writing about the writer's intention and the reader's response and looking for alternative interpretations, if those were the kind of foci of what I had been teaching, then all of my comments tended to be based around those things, and therefore I ended up writing maybe 10 times, excellent use of P paragraphs, you need to look to make alternative interpretations. And one of the things that really brought it home to me is that my handwriting isn't very good. So I was putting all of this effort in to marking work. It was very repetitive what I was writing, and it was, to cap it all off, very untidy. So the actual end result wasn't even something I was particularly proud of. That I knew something had to change. So I came up with using marking grids, and I'll show you a marking grid and I'll show you an example of how to use them, and then I will go over the sort of pros of using them. But basically a marking grid is something you make to mark a piece of work. So here is a piece of work. It's gone too far. This is something from my upcoming ebook. It's a mock answer to the question, compare the methods poets use to convey love in Sonnet 116 and one other poem. So obviously it's from the English literature course, and I think this is a good example. Obviously this is typed, but this is a good example of what it can be like when you're marking work. You can look at a piece of work and think, where do I start? There is so much here. Where do I start? And I think the marking grids will help you with that. So the marking grids look something like this. The suggestion I'm making to you is that you, for every piece of written work that you're going to mark, that you make a grid. Basically use Microsoft Word to make a table, and that you make it for following this format. So you have your success criteria, which is essentially what a good answer should include. And then you have the box yes, partial, no, and then down here comment and target. Now you might be sat there thinking that would take me ages to make in Microsoft Word. But the good news is you can make one and then you can just adapt it over time as you go on to a different piece. So I want you to imagine that I've been teaching the poems from the literature course to my class, building up to an assessment that they are aiming for B grades and A grades, and I have given them a mock question, the one I just showed you on the screen, and I'm going to mark their answers. Well, there are a number of ways you can do that. You could print off the mark scheme from the past exam, and you can have it beside all the work and then read through the work with your red pen and do the kind of tick, cross, question mark, I like this, great idea, not sure, quotation here, all of those kind of scribbles that you put on the page. Or you could make something like this. Now what I do here is I go to the band that my class is aiming for, and I look at the things that make the top grade answers from the mark scheme, and I break them down into student-friendly language, and I put them in here. Now, I've done this in advance. I've done this as part of my endpoint planning, so actually the students know about all of these four things. We've had lessons on all of these four things. None of this is a surprise, and in fact, and here's the really great bit about this way of marking, before I gave the students the assessment, I gave them this grid, and I told them, okay class, these are the four things you're going to be marked on in this assessment. It's a reading assessment. You are not going to be marked on your sentence variety, spelling, punctuation, grammar. You're not going to be marked on anything except the four things here. So the class are very aware of what they need to do to hit those target grades. I tell them, this equates to roughly, let's say, a grade B. And they can have that in front of them all through the assessment. So that's their success criteria for writing the piece. It's also my success criteria for marking the piece. So it serves a dual purpose. And then what I do is I read through their answer, and I look for times where they've used P paragraphs. I look for times where they've written about the effect on the reader, the author's intention, of course, poet's intention in this case. And I look for where they might have used alternative interpretations. And if they've done it consistently through the answer, I tick the yes box. If they've done it a little bit but not all the way through, I tick the partial, and if they haven't done it at all, I tick the no. Now here's the really important part, and this really helps you to focus your marking as a teacher. As a result, my comment and my target come out of this success criteria. It is no good setting a target which is not related to the success criteria, because I can't write for my target, for example, remember that the poet's names need to be capital letters. That's true, but it's not a good enough target for this assessment because it's not the criteria that I've told the students they're being marked on, and therefore it's not fair. It's like setting unknown parameters and boundaries. So the comment would simply be commenting on something they did well. So say they wrote about the effect of the reader really well, you'd say, brilliant comments on the effect on the reader. Your target would be something they didn't do so well on. So say they didn't have any alternative interpretations, your target would simply be include alternative interpretations. This really helps you to frame your marking, and what you do is you just print them off onto a Word document. You copy and paste the grid, so you've got, let's say, 3 per page, and then what you do is you print them onto coloured paper, because coloured paper always has more impact, and the students know then it's something important. It's either their endpoint plan or their assessment feedback. You get a bit of a code system. So I always print mine on this goldy yellow paper. So anywhere you find that paper in their books or their folders, it's my feedback. That's what that's for. It shows it's not just a worksheet or a handout from a lesson or whatever. And then, you go through their answer and you look for these things. So because I know what I'm looking for, I ignore other things. Okay, now, I'm not saying that you should not address literacy errors in a piece of writing, even if it is assessed on reading skills. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that this helps you to focus what you're doing with your marking. And, you go through the answer and you fill in the grid, something like this. Now, I've typed mine here because I couldn't write it on the screen, but normally I'd write this. So you just tick the boxes. A comment might be, each point well linked to author's intention. The target, aim to include alternative interpretations for each main point. Done. Now, an advanced level target would be framed as a question. So that's something you can aim to do in your target setting, is to set a question such as how might a historical audience interpret this poem, or how might a reader from a different country interpret this poem. So you can actually set questions which are, hinting at your target, and that helps students to engage in them. But that's pretty much the way I do my marking. Now, why? Let me finish with some thoughts on why that is a good idea. Well, to begin with, it creates this lovely open system where if you create the grid beforehand, it makes the students aware of what you're marking for and what excellent work should include. It also makes you aware of it because it's so easy to, think about what you think a good answer is. But actually, if you use the exam mark scheme or the National Curriculum Framework or whatever your assessment points are, you might be surprised and think, oh, right, they need to do that as well. It saves time and pointless repetition. So although I'm still writing targets and I'm still writing comments, I'm saving time in the sense that I know the areas I'm looking for and I'm just ticking the right boxes. I don't have to annotate the piece at all. I don't have to write on the student's work at all if I don't want to. Of course you can do, but it saves all of that time and effort for doing that. It helps you focus your comments on relevant criteria. Now, some of you won't like this, but this is my personal belief, and I have heard, data that backs it up. Gushy comments, long, overflowing comments from teachers that write something like, oh, thank you, Sarah, I really enjoyed reading this. It was such an interesting thing, and I really value your comments about this, that, and the other. It just doesn't do anything. It takes you half an hour to write, and you end up with a piece of work that's got loads of writing all over it. And, actually, it's not focused on the assessment criteria. It's not focused on telling them how to do better. So it helps you avoid that if you use these grids. And I would say that if you're PGCE, NQT, you quite easily fall into that trap of writing too much. and then you do 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and you go home and you cry and you think, how can this ever be sustainable? Well, this is one of the ways. You personally might be someone who would love to have feedback that was written in that kind of long, emotive, gushy way, but you can't do that and sustain it when you're teaching 22 hours a week, when you've got all of the deadlines to hit. So avoid those gushy comments. Make sure that your positives and your targets are all just based on the success criteria, which is set beforehand, that the students know they're being marked on. And of course, then it helps to inform your next step teaching. So when you've done all of your marking, you look at it, you think, well, hang on, 3/4 of the class didn't write any alternative interpretations. Therefore, and you can see that, by the way, by just looking at where your ticks are in the grids. You don't have to go back over all of your written notes over pages and pages of answers. You think, therefore, I probably haven't taught the alternative interpretation skill well enough, so my next lesson will focus on that, and I'll perhaps give them their work back then and see if they can add an alternative interpretation. So that's my idea for marking grids. Please do email me, abruff@live.co.uk, if you'd like me to send you some of my marking grids. Check out mrbruff.com too for lots of other goodies. Like I say, this isn't necessarily mind-blowing. There may be many of you teachers who are already doing this, but I know from my experience with NQTs in particular that this will absolutely help you to revolutionize your workload. And at the end of the day, the students are still coming away with what they need, which is a knowledge of what they've done well and what they need to do to improve. How can that be wrong? It might not be as emotional and as personal as you like, but I think, in terms of the time frame that we have as teachers, you don't have time to do that. So you do that through your verbal feedback. So there's nothing wrong when you give the work back to the student saying, oh, Sarah, I really enjoyed reading this. I thought it was really good. Your points were so original, and I really, I thought you were so insightful. You can do all of that through your verbal feedback. So you still make the same points, but why write it all out? Okay, so I hope this has been useful. Please do subscribe to this channel. I've got 10 subscribers. Let's build that up and keep the numbers growing, and I'll do more videos. Thank you.